Hey everyone, great to be back with you all, and thrilled to be doing more spooky fun stuff this October. This next title held a very strong place in my heart back when it first came out in 2000. I remember lamenting over the fact that American McGee's Alice was a PC-only game, as I didn't have anything that could even play modern PC games just yet. But that all changed a few years later when I got my first gaming laptop, and the rest was history. But what to think of it now? This game has now been around for almost 20 years, which is not exactly recent. Can it be as good as I remember? Strap in, and we'll see just how well American McGee's Alice for the PC holds up today. Developed by Rogue Entertainment and published by EA Games in December of 2000, American McGee's Alice is a third-person action-adventure, shooter, platformer, and survival horror title all in one. Conceived by American McGee, a former employee of id Studios who previously helped work on multiple titles like the Doom, Quake, and Hexent series of games, this project would take the world of Alice that we all knew from Lewis Carroll's classic stories, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There, and turn them completely on their heads with a darker, more twisted vision. The story goes like this. Alice, while dreaming of Wonderland in her bed, is awoken by a house fire. Alice manages to get out of the house in time, but both of her parents are now dead, and Alice is brought to Rutledge Asylum, undergoing years of treatment in order to bring her out of her catatonic state. Suddenly, Alice is called by her stuffed rabbit, and her mind reverts back to Wonderland once again. But Wonderland is no longer the world that she remembers. Due to the horrible trauma of recent events, Wonderland has now become a dark and terrifying place, with environments and characters now bleak and disfigured. She sees the White Rabbit, who tells Alice to follow him, right before the Cheshire Cat appears, to slightly bring Alice up to speed on recent events.
You've gone quite mangy, Cat, but your grin's a comfort.
And you've picked up a bit of an attitude, still curious and willing to learn, I hope.
The Queen of Hearts rules over the land and put all of Wonderland's people in captivity, with threats of death as the only alternative. The Cheshire Cat tells Alice to pursue the White Rabbit, and the adventure begins. Let's start with the game's presentation, as it is rightfully the most talked about element. For a game that came out in 2000, everything here still looks surprisingly stylish, albeit bleak and upsetting. From the dark and deformed appearances of Wonderland's characters to the grim setting, the game's visuals create a unique mix of hopelessness with an imaginative twist that brings it into more of a Kafka-esque territory. Just look at this door animation in the background. Impressed? That was simply part of the scenery. And you'll notice plenty more interesting background tricks to make these areas stand out. Here you can see piles of books in the back among the void of nothing. Or here you can see all kinds of clocks bouncing and pocket watches flying about. Details like this are always worth noting, as they are the parts likely to stick with us the most, outside of the unique and creepy character designs. Speaking of the character designs, wow. All of these have such strange and unique designs, I don't think it's even possible to forget any of them. Especially the Cheshire Cat, who has pretty much given me nightmares ever since I first saw him back in 2000. Other faces like the Mad Hatter and the Queen of Hearts also leave some pretty unforgettable charm to them, that's sure to stick with you, if the violence doesn't already. Wow, that is violent. And of course none of this would be nearly as compelling without a good voice cast to go with it, and I'm happy to say this game delivers on that count. The dialogue is mostly dark and disturbing, with hints of comedy now and then.
And if not, there may be more than one way to skin a cat, if you'll pardon the expression.
Most unpleasant metaphor. Please avoid it in future. Here's a riddle. When is a croquet mallet like a billy club? I tell you, whenever you want it to be.
On top of all this, you get some nice, haunting melodies that play as you explore everything this new dark Wonderland has to offer. Although I wish there was more to the song variety overall, I did really enjoy every track here, so I never found myself getting tired of it. Next, we'll talk about the gameplay. Some may be surprised to know that this game actually runs off the same engine used in Quake 3 Arena, with some modifications. This makes the majority of Alice's movements exactly the same as the ones you'd see in most shooters released at the time. The W, A, S, and D keys move Alice forward and backward, with left and right strafing. The spacebar is your jump button, while the mouse is what you use to aim and attack with, using the left mouse button for each weapon's basic attack, and the right mouse button to use its more powerful move. Outside of your basic melee weapons, all projectile attacks have a limit called Strength of Will, which is represented by the blue bar on the right side of the screen. Alice can pick up more of this by defeating enemies or finding it scattered throughout the stages. You can also switch between your various weapons, or toys as the game calls it, by using the number keys. As I said, it's all very much the same as most shooters of the era. Pointing your reticle at the enemies also serves as a lock-on mechanic as you see the blue marker begin to circle around the enemies you're pointing at. The weapons themselves are pretty unique and varied, ranging all the way from your basic knife to playing cards that you throw to a croquet mallet, all the way to ice staffs and dice that cause a demon to appear and fight enemies for you. The jacks were also a nice touch. Lastly, Alice can also come across a rage box, which will temporarily increase her attack power, and make her look awesome.
Time to raise some havoc. The dogs of war are loose.
I'm also happy to say that enemy variety was just enough to make me feel like I wasn't fighting the same two enemies in every room. While a few of them, like the playing card soldiers and flying banshees, definitely wear out their welcome by the latter half, there are plenty of other types like chess pieces, ants, and robots to keep it all from feeling dull. Now, as you can probably guess, being as this was made in the year 2000, there are parts of the gameplay that don't hold up terribly well. Platforming, for example, can feel like a nightmare in places. While Alice's movement in the game is generally smooth and fast, her jump ability is surprisingly stiff and clunky. I lost count of how many times I fell off of platforms due to Alice's jump either being just a little too far or just a little too close. For precision platforming such as this, I would have hoped for tighter controls to go with it. There is one dynamic where if you're close enough to a platform and point the mouse at it, the icon will change to feet, and Alice will be able to jump directly to where the feet are pointing. This is fine, but the amount of times you can actually use it are pretty few and far between, as the reticle has to be at just the right distance for it to work. And while I'm grateful that Alice can climb ledges, I do wish these animations were just a little faster, as it doesn't seem to match the rest of her moveset. Like I said though, I'm glad to have them, as the game would have been a lot more unforgiving without it. I also enjoyed the sections where the air would push Alice higher, as they allowed for much faster movement and felt more fluid as a result. On top of this, I also enjoyed most of the game's boss fights, even if there weren't a lot of them to go around. I think they were just enough to keep your interest going, and they provided enough of a challenge so that they didn't feel like repeats of all the other fights. The battles with the Mad Hatter and the Jabberwocky were especially hectic in this regard. Another aspect that may surprise and disappoint some people is the game is surprisingly linear, despite giving you the impression that it's going to be the opposite in places. While I won't say this ruined the experience for me or anything like that, I did find myself a little disappointed once I realized that there was only one main path to go in order to rebuild the Jabberwocky staff that you use in the later parts of the game. One other issue I'll cite is that if you try to play the game all in one go instead of taking it in smaller bursts, it will likely begin to feel a bit repetitive from time to time. When you're not solving puzzles, the gameplay generally consists of going from point A to point B, jumping across platforms, and fighting a lot of enemies along the way with the occasional cutscene interruption. Luckily, the imaginative scenery and creative bits of level design keep this from becoming too much of a problem at any point. I'm also happy to say that the story ended up being quite involved, and not feeling like some throwaway tale, or just an excuse to put Alice in a horror setting.
Everyone I love dies violently. Unnaturally. I'm cursed. Why go on? I'll just hurt others.
Throughout the entire game, you are constantly shown scenes with Alice confronting her PTSD and guilt over the events that killed her parents, and the game's characters even representing some of her innermost thoughts.
Your family was expecting you to come to them, weren't they? Perhaps they thought you might warn them of the danger, being close to the source as you were. But they waited in vain, didn't they? And died for their trouble.
As we progress forward, we also begin to see that most of Alice's actions and goals in the game are in fact steps to help her confront these very issues that have been eating her away, and bring Wonderland back to its former self. This is especially so as we approach the game's final boss, the Queen of Hearts. Why?
There is worse to come. You and this Red Queen cannot both survive. You are two parts of the same...
Yes, before the Cheshire Cat's sudden death, he was beginning to reveal the truth in that Alice and the Queen were one and the same. The Queen this entire time has been a representation of all of Alice's negative thoughts. This is what leads to the final confrontation and the Queen's statement that killing her would result in both of them dying. The final battle is quite a sequence, as it is both difficult and just plain terrifying to look at. Once you get the hang of aiming at her with the staff, things only get more ridiculous from here with the second phase. In this phase, the Queen seems to have a combination of attacks, all relating to the abilities of enemies you fought previously. You don't have a lot of moving room thanks to the small floating platforms around her, but she is thankfully a lot easier to hit and finish off. Once that's all done, the game's ending ensues, where Wonderland returns to its original state, and Alice, consequently, also begins to get better until she finally leaves the asylum. Her depression remained, as real depression does not magically go away, of course, but her outlook became one of confidence, with a drive to get better. The main question most gamers are going to have to ask themselves is if the gameplay sounds like it'll be too much to handle. While I never reached a point where I found it too difficult to manage, I am also in my 30s now, and not in the same age group as a lot of people who have already been playing games with smoother controls for years. Luckily, there are 4 different difficulty settings to choose from, if that helps you.
Off with her head.
So just how is the experience overall? Does it hold up? Is it something I'd recommend other people try if they can? Yes, and yes. Don't get me wrong here, the gameplay is far from perfect, and its flaws have only become all the more apparent as time goes on, but I can't imagine many people deciding to give up on it for that reason alone. The sheer atmosphere, warped versions of these characters that we once knew, and the graphical presentation, which also holds up surprisingly well even now, will simply enthrall you and give you that feeling of just one more level each and every time. You'll find some frustration in the platforming and slightly dated gameplay mechanics for sure, but you'll easily work with them just to see what else could be hiding around the next corner. It's a game that simply needs to be seen and heard to be believed, and I think it's something that every gamer should experience at least once, just to see what they've been missing out on all this time. And that's going to do it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Have you played this game before yourself? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're feeling really generous, consider donating to my Patreon, where awesome people like Erica, Brandon, Thomas, Salo, Johan, and Andrew Doss all help to keep this channel alive. Until next time, see you.